A lot of people ask me where I get all my video topics from. Like, how did I first learn about all the strange landmarks and historical oddities that I talk about on my channel? Well, the short answer is that I just do a lot of reading. I spend a ton of time flipping through history books and old newspapers, hunting for little tidbits that one day might make for an interesting video. But after doing this for a few years, I've also noticed a sort of cascade effect with video ideas, where learning about one interesting topic just kind of naturally leads me to other interesting topics, kind of like a waterfall. I start with one story, and as I do research, without even trying, I learn about 10 more stories along the way. But that's a whole big discussion for another video. Today, I want to do something much more simple. All I want to do is tell you a quick story about this huge stone wall that used to border a farm up in Westminster, Massachusetts. And more specifically, I want to explain why the farmer who used to live here decided to build such a gigantic wall. Because just look at this thing. It is absolutely massive. Why on earth would the farmer possibly need a wall this big? Especially because, as you can see, most of New England's other stone walls are way smaller. This one here that I've been standing in front of is a great example. This much shorter wall here probably also used to border a farm or pasture way back in the day. But as you can see, it's not nearly the size of that huge one up in Westminster. A couple hundred years ago, it was very typical for farmers to line the borders of their land with stone walls just like this one, mostly to keep farm animals either in pasture land for grazing or out of farmland so the animals wouldn't eat all the crops. There are literally tens of thousands of miles of these forgotten stone barriers snaking their way through the hills and woods of the countryside. Just look at this incredible map by the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Every single one of these pink lines is an old stone wall that's been marked out on the map. Whenever you see a wall like this one in New England, it's almost a guarantee that you're standing on what used to be a farm many, many years ago. Now, of course, some of you might be asking a pretty obvious question right about now. If these stone walls are supposed to be indicators that the surrounding area used to be farmland, then why is this particular wall in the middle of a forest? Because clearly this is not farmland, right? Well, believe it or not, this area was not always a forest. If you look closely, you can see that almost all of these trees are very young, at least as far as trees go. The vast majority here are well under 100 years old, which means that over a century ago, this area probably was pasture land or a crop field with hardly any trees around at all. It's just sometime in the last 150 years or so, the land stopped being used for farming, and then over time, without someone here to maintain the land, a forest just grew up instead. What's really interesting though is that this is far from a rare scenario in New England. Huge portions of New England's now famous forests just straight up did not exist a couple hundred years ago. Like back in the 1800s, this little forest that I'm standing in probably looked a whole lot like this picture of Norfolk, Connecticut from the 1890s. Open pasture with stone walls crisscrossing across the landscape. There's actually a lot of old photos and drawings out there showing how these stone wall patchwork farms used to look. Quite the departure from the heavily forested hills that dominate the New England countryside today. Now, to be clear, there definitely are plenty of open fields and farms still left in New England nowadays. It's just that a couple centuries ago, they were way more common. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, huge portions of New England's forests were cut down both for timber and to make room for farms, to a degree that's almost kind of hard to wrap your head around today. Like, check this out. Right now, about 60% of Massachusetts is forested, whereas back in the mid-1800s, that number was more like 20%. That is less than Indiana and Arizona has today. To really illustrate how big of a change we're talking about here, check out this old postcard that I have of Frog Rock up in New Boston, New Hampshire. This picture was taken sometime before 1907, and as you can see, there are no trees anywhere near the rock. But if we take this card up to New Hampshire today, then we can see that Frog Rock is completely surrounded by trees in 2025. Pretty crazy transformation, right? This is the exact same thing that happened to all the stone walls out in New England's forests. Over the years, the trees regrew around Frog Rock, just like they regrew around all those stone walls. And by the way, in case you're wondering how I know that this postcard was printed before 1907, it's actually because of the back of the card. See how this other postcard I have has a line running down the back, dividing the card so that you can write the address on one side and a message on the other side? Well, these lines only started appearing on postcards in 1907. So, because our Frog Rock card does not have a line, we know that it was printed before 1907. Pretty cool, right? Oh, and also this other card that I was using as an example here actually has a very nice picture of a sheep pasture in Massachusetts back in the early 1900s. Another fantastic example of how New England used to look before the forests were allowed to regrow. I actually have quite a few postcards showing pictures of sheep pastures from around this same time, because sheep was hugely popular as livestock back during the 1800s. And in fact, one of the main reasons that so much farmland was eventually abandoned back to the trees in the late 1800s and early 1900s was because the western states began to start raising sheep too, and New England just could not keep up with the competition. And so, acres and acres of old sheep grazing land became forest again. By the way, some of you with sharp eyes might have noticed that most of these pastures haven't actually been completely cleared of trees. Most of the time, there's at least one or two big trees left standing out in the fields. Well, as we can see from this postcard, there's a good reason for that. When farmers were cutting down forests, they would oftentimes leave a few trees standing so that their animals could get some shade on hot days. These are sometimes referred to as pasture trees or lone wolf trees because they are the last remnants of the old forest that used to stand in these fields before they were cut down. And the real cool thing about these pasture trees is that a lot of them are still standing today, hidden away in the new forests that eventually regrew over these pastures. Here's how you can recognize one. First, they'll just be way bigger than all the other trees, obviously, because they're way older, right? But a pasture tree will also have a very unique branch structure in comparison to the other trees. See, when a tree grows up by itself with no other trees around, its branches grow outward, right? They grow wide, away from the tree, because they want as much sunlight as possible and they got all that space to stretch out. But if a tree grows up around other trees in like a forest, it's pointless to stretch your branches out wide because the sunlight is just going to get blocked by all the other branches above you, right? So instead, a tree growing in a forest is most of the time going to go straight and up as fast as it can to try and get above the canopy and reach the sunlight. This is an effect that you can see for yourself pretty much anywhere that trees grow. Like, look at this ash tree growing by itself in the middle of this lawn. It's got a whole bunch of big, thick, low-hanging branches stretching wide away from the tree, right? Now, compare that to the trees in this forest just a few feet away. A lot of these are also ash trees, but as you can see, they don't have any low branches because what would be the point in growing low branches if they're just going to be in the shade of the taller trees? And so a pasture tree will typically not only be older and bigger than all the other younger trees in the forest, it'll also be much wider with branches stretching very far out away from the tree. Here, let me show you an absolutely beautiful example in this very typical young Connecticut forest. Now, before I show you this tree, I want you to really think about what you're about to see here. Hundreds of years ago, this tree sat and watched as every single one of its neighbors was cut down. It spent decades all by itself, alone on an open pasture, growing and growing before now finally bearing witness to the return of the woods. This is a pasture tree, the last sentinel of an ancient forest. Pretty cool, right? Let's look at some more pasture trees that I found around New England. Not all of these are guaranteed to be holdovers from the original New England forests, but they all very clearly started growing long before the young forests that have sprung up around them. Like here is a giant ash tree right up against a stone wall. And here we have a massive eastern white pine up in the New Hampshire snow. And here's an ash tree that actually swallowed up the barbed wire that once encircled this field here. Just goes to show you how long this giant has really been standing here. Here, we sadly have a fallen pasture tree. Of course, because these trees are so old, a lot of them are either dead or dying. At some point in the future, the last New England pasture trees will die, and with them, so too shall the original forests that once occupied these landscapes. And finally, here's one of my very favorites, a beautiful sweet birch in Rhode Island. This particular tree is so big that it's actually the official Rhode Island state champion sweet birch tree, which just means that it's the biggest known sweet birch in the whole state. See, if you've never heard of champion trees before, it's actually a pretty cool system. Whatever the biggest known tree is for a given species is the champion for its species. Almost all US states keep track of their champion trees. I've actually visited quite a few of them myself. Like here, we have the Connecticut state champion Quonset cherry tree at a park. And this is the Massachusetts state champion eastern white pine at a cemetery. This is the Rhode Island state champion Sergeant's weeping hemlock tree on the property of an old mansion. Here we have the Rhode Island state champion Japanese pagoda tree at a park. This is the Connecticut state champion eastern hemlock at another cemetery. The Connecticut state champion red spruce, which is also in a cemetery. And finally, here is the Rhode Island state champion red oak, right smack dab in the middle of the city of Providence. This tree is one of my personal favorites. By the way, you might have noticed during that little montage there that several of those champion trees were in cemeteries, right? Well, there's actually a pretty interesting reason for that. To help explain, I'll use this tiny little cemetery in the woods of Rhode Island as an example. Look at these giant eastern white pines within the walls of the cemetery. They are absolutely massive in comparison to the trees in the surrounding forest, most likely because these pine trees were spared when the rest of the surrounding forest was cleared to make room for farmland or cut down for timber, similar to what happened with the pasture trees. The farmers certainly are not going to work the land inside this cemetery, right? So why bother cutting down the tree? Especially because these could very well be decorative trees meant to honor those who were buried in the cemetery. Also, real quick, Watching that footage there, some of you might be wondering why there's such a teeny tiny cemetery just completely alone in the Rhode Island woods, right? I mean, just look at this satellite view of the forest. Here is where the cemetery is. No roads, no buildings, no nothing anywhere nearby. Well, believe it or not, Rhode Island is actually chock full of hidden little cemeteries just like that one. Despite being the smallest state in the country that takes less than an hour to drive across, Rhode Island has over 3,000 cemeteries within its borders. Per square mile, that is between 6 and 10 times as many cemeteries as all the other states on the East Coast. Just look at all these beautiful little Rhode Island cemeteries hidden away in the trees. So what is going on here, right? Why does Rhode Island in particular have so many of these miniature cemeteries? Well, the answer has to do with the fact that Rhode Island was actually the first American colony to establish a separation of church and state. Starting in the 1600s, Rhode Island allowed its residents a much greater degree of religious freedom than most of the other colonies that would eventually become the United States. And it was because of this history of religious tolerance that Rhode Island ended up with so many tiny cemeteries. See, in most of the other colonies, each town was kind of built around one central church, right? And so, if anybody died in the town, they would be buried in the one central cemetery that was associated to that one central church. Sort of like this example in Woodstock, Connecticut. Here's our church, and here is our big cemetery connected to the church. But in Rhode Island, because of the colony's religious freedom, one town could have several churches and a population who believed in several different religions. So instead of one centralized burial ground, a town in Rhode Island might have a whole bunch of smaller cemeteries. And in fact, many families in Rhode Island just decided to establish their own cemeteries right on the edge of their property. They just bury everybody in a little corner of their farm or something. There wasn't a unified cemetery in town, so they just make their own. Or maybe even they'd get a plot in their neighbor's cemetery down the road. And that is probably why this little graveyard is now hidden away in the woods. The people who created this cemetery sold the land or moved or died out, and over time, the woods just grew up around the graveyard. I had to put on my coat and gloves because it's getting cold. Anyway though, to be clear, this isn't a hard and fast rule or anything. There definitely are some big church cemeteries in Rhode Island, and likewise, there are plenty of tiny little cemeteries in the other New England states. It's just that Rhode Island in particular has a whole lot more of them. What's really interesting though is that not all of these forgotten cemeteries are hidden away in an isolated forest. Sometimes, instead of returning to the woods, the land around the graveyard developed in a very different direction. Like, check this out. Here we are in a quaint, beautiful little Rhode Island cemetery that is now entirely surrounded by a used car lot. And here we have a pretty little cemetery in the parking lot of a Staples. At this cemetery, you can pay your respects to the dead and then go register your car at the DMV. And at this one, you can spend some time connecting with local history and then go get a latte from the Dunkin' Donuts drive-thru. Here's one that's right in the middle of a yacht club. Just look at all those boats. And here we got one that's just in the parking lot of a gas station. And right here is probably my favorite. If you walk into the woods behind this dumpster at a CVS pharmacy, then you'll find one of the most beautiful cemeteries that you'll ever lay eyes on, totally hidden away in a forgotten patch of woods. Pretty cool, right? I could literally show you strange Rhode Island cemetery locations for hours. Like maybe one day I'll make a top 50 weirdest places for a cemetery video. But hey, I feel like there's a bit of an elephant in the room, right? You might be thinking to yourself, all right, so Rhode Island has a lot of little cemeteries because of the colony's early respect for religious freedom. Makes sense. But why was Rhode Island so religiously tolerant in the first place? Well, the answer lies with this man, Roger Williams, the original founder of the colony that would eventually become Rhode Island. Williams was originally a preacher up in Salem, Massachusetts, who was staunchly in favor of religious freedom. He was a very vocal critic of the lack of separation between church and state in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so, in 1635, he was banished from Massachusetts, kicked out of the colony, in large part for arguing against the civil domination of the church. And from there, I'm sure you can guess what happened next. Roger Williams went down south from Massachusetts and founded the settlement of Providence and eventually the religiously tolerant colony of Rhode Island. From the very beginning, Rhode Island was established upon the principles of religious liberty. Pretty cool that there's a cemetery and a Dunkin' Donuts drive-thru in 2025 because a rebel preacher got kicked out of Massachusetts 400 years ago. Now, as you might expect, many Rhode Islanders are very proud of the story behind the establishment of their state. There's even a very nice little monument in Providence that commemorates the arrival of Roger Williams. Williams first landed in Rhode Island after crossing the Seekonk River here, so the monument includes a very pretty depiction of Williams greeting the local Narragansett tribe on the shore of the river. There's actually a lot of old drawings and paintings out there of this particular moment. You know, like dramatizations of Williams first setting foot in Rhode Island. And one interesting thing that you might notice in all these pictures is the prevalence of a big rock on the shore of the river. And for good reason. That is Slate Rock, a legendary landmark in Rhode Island's history. Supposedly, the exact spot where Roger Williams first landed his boat. Believe it or not, I myself actually have a pretty interesting history with Slate Rock. A while ago, I heard about the rock and decided to head down to Seekonk River to see the famous landmark for myself. But, as you can see, there's no sign of that stone outcropping nowadays. So, I did some research, and I learned something pretty crazy about Slate Rock. Apparently, the reason that the stone is no longer visible is because in 1877, they accidentally blew it up with dynamite. Yeah, and to make matters worse, they blew it up with dynamite while trying to construct a park around the rock. I guess the stone had kind of gotten buried over time, and so the city hired someone to use a little dynamite to try and expose the stone a little more, but they used too much, and so they blasted the rock into pieces. Isn't that just wild? While trying to construct a park to honor a historic landmark, they blew up the landmark. But hey, all that said, believe it or not, there actually still exists a way to view Slate Rock in 2025. At least kind of. See, as I was reading about Slate Rock, I found this, a Freemasonry magazine from 1860 that mentions that a local Freemason chapter was going to cut out several feet of the rock to use as a pedestal. And so what I did was make some phone calls and ask around, and eventually I was granted permission to visit the Rhode Island Grand Lodge of Freemasons. And in that Grand Lodge was the actual pedestal that was cut out of slate rock. Over 160 years later, there it is. Pretty cool, right? What's really interesting though, is there's actually a few other pieces of slate rock scattered around Rhode Island. Most of them are in various museums and historical societies, but one of my favorites is at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. If we walk through the gates of the college and head towards the back of the campus, then we'll find this bear statue that actually has a piece of slate rock embedded in the base. Another hidden little piece of Rhode Island's history. By the way, as we were walking through the gates of Brown University there, some of you might have noticed this big building on campus. And specifically, you might have noticed how Greek this building looks. Seems a little out of place in Rhode Island, doesn't it? Well, this is Manning Hall, constructed in 1834, a fantastic example of the Greek Revival architectural movement. Between roughly 1820 and 1860, a lot of buildings in the United States were built in this style. Just in Providence alone, there are many more examples. Like here, we have the Old Stone Bank, built in 1854. And here is the Providence Arcade, a mall built in 1828. Here is the Beneficent Congregational Church, completed in 1836. And here we have a library, the Providence Athenaeum, built in 1838. The hallmarks of the Greek Revival style are very obvious once you learn to recognize them. Most Greek Revival buildings are symmetrical, and they often have triangle-shaped gables called pediments. And of course, who could ever miss those mighty columns? The Greek Revival movement was incredibly fashionable during the first half of the 1800s. Lots and lots of big, grand, beautiful buildings were made in this style. But here's a question for you. What happens if you want to build a Greek Revival building, but you don't have a lot of money? What if, instead of the big city of Providence, Rhode Island, you're building a little church in the small, rural community of Exeter, Rhode Island? What if you want to build an interesting, modern, and beautiful church in the Greek Revival style, but you just don't have the money or the materials to emulate those big, fancy buildings up in Providence? Well, if you're Russell and Harry Jocelyn, a couple of small-town carpenters, you just try your best, and you make something that is truly wonderful in its own way. This is the Chestnut Hill Baptist Church in Exeter, Rhode Island. A little church that really is just trying its best to fit in with the Greek Revival style. It's symmetrical, just like the bigger buildings, and it has a pediment, just like its brothers in Providence, and it even has those famous Greek columns. At least kinda. These things are really more like wooden rectangles attached to the front of the building that are pretending to be columns, but hey, the effect is still there, right? I don't know about you, but I think this is a very charming little church. A great example of what you can make when you really put your heart into a project. Also, real quick, while we're at this church, I feel like I should take the opportunity to show you something that's pretty incredible. See, believe it or not, in the cemetery behind this church is the gravestone of a vampire. Or at least an accused vampire. The story here has to do with an old New England superstition about the disease tuberculosis. Some New Englanders used to think that if someone in your family died from tuberculosis and then you got sick, then your dead relative might be a vampire sucking away your life force from beyond the grave. The only reliable way to stop the vampire was to dig up their body and burn their internal organs to kill off the undead once and for all. And that is exactly what happened to Mercy Brown. In January of 1892, Mercy Brown died of consumption, and then her brother also got sick, so George Brown, their father, had Mercy dug up, and then he cremated her heart and liver. Pretty dang grim, right? Well, believe it or not, there's actually many more vampire graves all around New England. Like here's one up in Manchester, Vermont. Rachel Burton was thought to be a vampire in 1793, so her body was exhumed and her heart burned to ash at the local blacksmith shop. Here's one in Cornwall, Connecticut. In January of 1869, Emily Ford got sick and died of tuberculosis, and then her brother also got sick not too long after. And so Emily's family thought she might be a vampire and had her dug up and burned her organs to try and save the life of her brother. Or how about this? Here is a whole family of vampires in Jewett City, Connecticut. Lemuel, Elisha, and Henry Ray, two brothers and their father, who were all three dug up on suspicion of vampirism back in 1854. Pretty crazy, right? You'd never know that this quiet little Connecticut cemetery contained the graves of three accused vampires. Oh, and hey, real quick, just a couple feet away, in this very same cemetery is another interesting little grave. Just listen to this. As you heard, this headstone is made entirely out of metal, and more specifically, it's made out of zinc. Nowadays, this type of headstone is often nicknamed as a zinker. Originally marketed as white bronze in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you can spot zinkers all across New England and sometimes even in the rest of the United States. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, from the very simple and small to the very large and ornate. The real fun thing about zinkers, though, is that basically every single one of them was manufactured by one company in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So pretty much every zinker that you'll ever see, no matter how far apart and no matter how different in style, all came from the same place originally. And because they were only manufactured for a few years around the turn of the 19th century, they were all constructed right around the same time, too. I've even read some stories saying that because zinkers are hollow, they were sometimes used to hide liquor during Prohibition in the United States. Zinkers aren't super rare or anything, but they're not exactly common either, so it's always a treat to come across one in a cemetery. Just look at this handsome little zinker in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. A beautiful piece of cemetery history. And hey, you know what? While we're in this cemetery, there's actually another real interesting headstone right around here. How about I tell you the story as we walk over and take a look? The grave we're heading over to now is for a doctor named William Rothwell, who used to practice medicine here in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Dr. Rothwell was an exceedingly generous man. In particular, there was nothing in the world that he loved more than picking up checks. At basically any event he ever attended, he was always the one to pay the bill. And in fact, he did this so often that the doctor even had a little catchphrase. Whenever it was time to pay at the end of the night, Dr. Rothwell would raise up his voice and yell out, "This is on me." He did this so often that he eventually just started signing checks by writing "This is on me" on them, because everybody knew who that was. People would literally walk up to him on the street and say, "This is on me," as if it was a greeting. Like truly, the phrase "this is on me" became synonymous with the doctor. And so, before Dr. Rothwell died in 1939, he had a very special headstone constructed to mark his grave. This big boulder sitting right here, a huge hunk of rock that Dr. Rothwell specifically picked out from his farm to serve as a headstone. And if we look real close at the bottom of the boulder, then we can see his little phrase immortalized forever. "This is on me." A bit of a double joke, because yup, that boulder definitely is on you, Dr. Rothwell. And hey, speaking of the boulder, this big rock itself is actually pretty interesting all on its own, independent of Dr. Rothwell's joke. Remember I said earlier that Dr. Rothwell had this hauled to the cemetery from his farm? Well, the New England countryside is actually littered with big rocks just like this one. The entire region is covered with stones. If you head out into the hills and forests, then you'll see them for sure. There are many, many big boulders out there, just like the one that Dr. Rothwell used for his headstone. On the side of the road, in the middle of cemeteries, you can find them anywhere. There's even a name for rocks like this, glacial erratics. And with a name like that, I'm sure you can guess that all these boulders are here because of glaciers. Thousands of years ago, a big glacier pushed its way down into New England from up north, and along the way, that glacier picked up a whole bunch of big rocks and carried them down south, hundreds of miles into New England. And then later, when the glacier eventually melted and retreated, all those rocks were just dropped haphazardly all across the region. And that is why sometimes you might be in a totally regular looking forest just like this, and then all of a sudden, big giant boulder completely by itself. No other rocks anywhere nearby. Now, as you might expect, because of how prominent they can be in the landscape, humans have always had a kind of interest in glacial erratics. A lot of them have even been given names. Like, remember Frog Rock from earlier? Well, that is a glacial erratic that just happens to look like a frog. Or how about this one? Cradle Rock in Barre, Massachusetts. Here, the glacier dropped two big boulders right on top of each other, forever engaged in a stone balancing act. Here's one in Norton, Massachusetts called Devil's Foot Rock because of an old folktale that the depressions in the stone were caused by the devil's burning hoof print. But you know, people did more than just give these rocks names. Sometimes they interacted with them a little bit. Like, check this out. Here is a glacial erratic in Chester, Massachusetts that has been converted into a tomb. See the stone door cut out of the front there? The guy buried inside this rock is named Hiram Smith. When Hiram was a young boy, he had to watch as his grandfather's coffin was lowered into an open grave full of water and mud. It had been raining heavily leading up to the day of the funeral, and so when the coffin was placed into the grave, it just got swallowed up and disappeared into the wet, soupy dirt. Apparently, the experience traumatized poor Hiram so badly that he became completely disgusted with the idea of an underground burial. He wanted to make sure that he would never suffer the same fate as his grandfather. And so, Hiram had a tomb carved out of this rock so that he could forever rest inside of a dry stone instead of the wet, muddy ground. Pretty unique landmark, right? Well, over in Gloucester, Massachusetts, we have another great example of humans putting their fingerprints on New England's natural glacial erratics. This is a Babson boulder. And this is another Babson boulder. And here is a Babson boulder. And there is a Babson boulder. And that is a Babson boulder. And over there we got a Babson boulder. And here is a Babson boulder. All right, so what the heck is a Babson boulder? Well, back during the Great Depression, a wealthy entrepreneur and investor named Roger Babson had the idea to hire a bunch of unemployed stone workers to carve a bunch of inspirational phrases into glacial erratic boulders. The idea being that the stone workers would finally get some work during the Great Depression, and anybody else who was suffering financially who happened to pass by the boulders would see the inspirational message and be filled with a surge of confidence. I gotta say though, I'm not so sure how inspirational some of these messages really are. Like, imagine you're an out-of-work tradesman and you're struggling to get by and you're trying your hardest to feed your family, and you hear about a nice walk through a beautiful landscape littered with phrases that are supposed to get your spirits back on the right track. So you head on over and you hop on the trail, and this is the first thing that you see. By the way, I should mention that big giant glacial erratic boulders are not the only type of rock created by glaciers in New England. See, as those glaciers pushed their way down through New England, they also tore up the bedrock beneath the soil, splintering off all these small stones and rocks as they grinded down southwards, scattering pieces of rock all over the place as they went. And so, to this day, New England soil is littered with small rocks and stones, a fact that has historically been a big problem for the local farmers. Just look at this old picture of a sheep pasture in Vermont from 1922. Tons and tons of smaller stones all across the field. These stones were annoying for livestock farmers, like in that picture, but they were especially obstructive for anyone who was trying to grow crops. You basically had to put in the work to clear out the rocks if you wanted to be able to properly work your land. And just to make things really tough, clearing rocks out of your land was not just a one-time job. See, because there's a whole bunch of stones mixed in with the soil, whenever the ground freezes in the winter, the earth contracts and pushes new rocks up to the surface. So clearing rocks off of your pasture was an annual commitment, to the point where there's even an old joke in New England where farmers say that the absolute best crop that they ever grow is rocks. They just keep rising on out of the soil like clockwork every single year. Now, of course, you might be wondering, what did the farmers do with all these rocks, right? I mean, if they were constantly clearing a whole bunch of stones from their property, they had to put the rocks somewhere, right? Well, most people actually used the rocks to build these big stone walls all around their property. The point of these walls was generally to keep farm animals either in pasture land for grazing or out of farmland so the animals wouldn't eat all the crops. These walls are a very common sight in New England. There are literally tens of thousands of miles of these forgotten stone barriers snaking their way through the hills and woods of the countryside. Just look at this incredible map by the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Every single one of these pink lines is an old stone wall that's been marked out on the map. There are just tons and tons of these things all over. Would you look at that? There's actually a perfect example of a New England stone wall right behind me. What a lucky coincidence. This is actually a great example of the typical size and shape of these old stone walls. But you know, while we're on the topic, occasionally you might come across a much bigger stone wall. Like, check this out. Here is a great example up in Westminster, Massachusetts. Look how absolutely gigantic this stone wall is. Now, of course, you might be wondering why this particular wall is so massive, right? A wall that big has to have an interesting story behind it. Well, back during the second half of the 1800s, two farmers used to live on opposite sides of this road. On one side was Farwell Morse, a very religious man, and on the other side was Edmund Proctor, who was not so religious. Supposedly, Proctor used to regularly work in his fields on the Sabbath day, and Morse would regularly criticize him for doing so. Eventually, Proctor got so fed up with Morse's constant disapproval that he decided to just block Morse's view of his field. That way, Morse wouldn't be able to see if Proctor was working on the Sabbath or not. And so, bit by bit, year after year, Proctor put together this absolutely massive stone wall between the two farms, completely blocking Morse's view of his field. By the time Proctor died in 1890, the wall was 11 feet tall and over 16 feet long. Pretty crazy, right? Many people call this thing the spite wall because it was constructed specifically to spite Proctor's neighbor. But hey, just wait a minute. I feel like we're getting way off topic, aren't we? I'm kind of getting the sense that we started off with something else. I was gonna tell you about some specific story about some cool landmark, and then I just got caught up telling you about all this other cool stuff. Man, what were we talking about? I don't know. I'm sure it'll come to me later. For now, let's just go back to what we were talking about a second ago. It was, New England stone walls, like this one here. Now, interesting thing about these walls, a lot of the time you'll find them out in the middle of some forest or woods, just like this one, which really doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because weren't these walls originally built on farms? What are they doing out in the woods? Well, believe it or not, this was not always a forest. If you look closely, then you can see that almost all of these trees are very young, at least as far as trees go. The vast majority here are well under 100 years old.